Thank you for joining The Right Dose. We will take a trip through the science behind pesticide use in Florida agriculture.
Our goal is to educate pesticide applicators and the public in the critical areas of integrated pest management according to Florida regulations.
So, sit back, relax, and put your learning hat on as we discuss the right dose and how we can positively impact our environment, our economy, and our communities.
This program is the product of a collaborative effort between agriculture extension agents and specialists from the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Science. Welcome back to another episode of The Right Dose. Today we're going to study chapter 6. So this chapter is going to talk about health effects and the emergency response. Why is this important? As pesticide applicators, we are using stuff or chemicals that are designed to kill and affect other creatures, but they can also affect the pesticide applicator or people around us when we are doing the pesticide applications. Today we have Aja, Luis, and Lourdes with us, and we are going to elaborate on this topic. The first thing that we want to study is what is SDS, or the Safety Data Sheet. Aja, can you help us define what this is?
When we're talking about pesticide safety, we have been saying, if you've listened to our other podcasts and read our book here, that we have the label is the law, right? So the label is the first source of information that we go to for directions for use, product information, and safety information. We also have another document that's just as important, and that's going to be the SDS, or the Safety Data Sheet, or as it used to be known as the Material Safety Data Sheet, MSDS. Same thing.
MSDS.
Yes.
I like that.
A lot of us remember MSDS. So, and what this document is this is a collection of all the precautionary information as it pertains to any kind of emergency situation when dealing with this chemical. So, they have kind of redefined these SDS sheets to make them more user-friendly and more standardized. The product manufacturer actually is the one who comes up with the SDS. It's their responsibility, and then it is approved by the EPA. But it has 16 different sections in it, and that's kind of the standardization that they've done to where it makes it more readable. But it's going to have information on any kind of first aid treatments, any kind of product information that's essential for those physicians and emergency personnel to know and understand. So if there is an emergency situation, you not only need to grab that label, but you also need to grab that SDS sheet as well and bring it with you.
So let's talk about exposure. We see this term exposure a lot. That exposure can be toxic, we can have a reaction to it, can be benign, can be a matter of time. You can have an exposure to a pesticide today, an exposure to that pesticide tomorrow, and eventually you're going to have a reaction if you're not careful. So what are the routes that that pesticide can make us sick, or the routes of exposure?
Okay, so the routes of exposure that we have, there's 4 routes of exposure. It's going to be oral, dermal, inhalation, and ocular. So let me go through each of these a little bit and just kind of highlight some of this. So of course, oral entry is going to be anything where you're ingesting that pesticide. And that not only is an accidental ingestion from possibly drinking something that was maybe improperly stored in a food container, which we should never ever do, right? But this also can kind of get to where pesticide applicators may get caught off guard. They are applying this pesticide and then they go and put a piece of gum in their mouth or something, and there's pesticide residue that can be on your hands and inadvertently get ingested into you. That's why it's always important to always wash your hands thoroughly before eating, drinking, or chewing tobacco, or using other forms of tobacco as well. The second route of exposure is going to be dermal. Now, this is where 97% of exposure happens when we're talking about pesticide applicators, mixers, or loaders, right? So any kind of handler. And this is your skin exposure. Again, this is your largest organ on your body. And a lot of times it's the hands and the forearms that get the most exposure from dermal because of those practices that we are doing. Oil and solvent-based formulations, such as those emulsifiable concentrates, those can be more readily absorbed into the skin. So there is another reason why we have to really know what we're dealing with and how to protect ourselves.
Yeah, and on that note, the skin is very permeable. We interact with the environment through the skin. That's why we sweat. That's why when we get cold, we get the goosebumps.
Right.
So we gotta think about that skin as something that can absorb chemicals from the environment.
Exactly. The third route of entry is going to be inhalation. And of course, this is when you're breathing in a pesticide. This can happen during application, or it can happen when you're mixing and loading, depending on the formulation, again, of that pesticide. There's the toxicity of the pesticide is going to really come into account when you're dealing with these different types of exposures. So you have to know what you're dealing with here. And then the last route of exposure is going to be ocular. And of course, that's your eye exposure, right? So anything that could potentially get into your eye. We have a lot of membranes in our eyes, which makes it more readily absorbed into our bloodstream and making those chemicals toxic to us. Now, when we're talking about all these different forms or routes of entry, this can happen, like I was saying, while we're mixing and loading this product or during application. So we have to really be mindful of what we're doing and the different ways that we could possibly be exposed to these chemicals.
And you talk a lot about pesticide toxicity there. We have to remind our audience that pesticide toxicity is very variable depending on the pesticide that we are working with, depending on the formulation of that pesticide, the active ingredient, etc. Based on that toxicity, based on the active ingredient, the way that the formulation is put together, that label is going to have information on protective equipment, personal protective equipment, or PPE that is required to apply this pesticide. So just keep that in mind. This oral, dermal, inhalation, and ocular exposures are the reason why we specifically use PPE, and the PPE is there to protect us in these key spots of our body. So let's move on to the differences between acute toxicity and chronic toxicity.
Yeah, so there's these two different types of toxicity, which is very important to know because, like you said earlier, in one of them, which is the acute toxicity, you can have symptoms right now, okay? A small dose of something that's spilled on you can actually have negative impact on your health in the moment, okay, today. However, the chronic toxicity, it's the harmful effects will start showing later. So if you were part of a spill today, you may not start noticing those effects until maybe a week from now, depending on what you're spraying or what you're working with. So it's very important to make sure that you know the difference between the two.
So if you are exposed to pesticides, if you have a spill, if you accidentally get sprayed by somebody, what are those things that we should be doing right after that exposure?
So there's a lot of different ways that we can react when an accident happens. I'm just going to mention a few of them, which I think that are the most important that we need to always have in mind. So the first one is always verify the safety data sheets. As Aja mentioned, that's that external documentation that that all pesticides must have. And some of the things that when we are dealing with this pesticide, those safety data sheet has to be posted in an area that every employee has access to it. So every time an accident happens with a pesticide, that employee can actually have access and then have the correct reaction into that accident that may have happened.
And that there's an EPA number in that label that if a medical professional needs to treat us for a specific pesticide intoxication, they can just type that and they can access that SDS. And on the SDS, there's going to be more further information on how to treat if you were exposed and the route of exposure, right?
Yes, and at the same time, as you said, if I don't have that SDS, I can actually get the SDA online too, using that APA number.
Mm-hmm.
So another thing that is very important is that before I actually help another person that has been exposed to pesticide, I have to protect myself. What I mean by that, if I saw that a person was exposed to pesticide and I don't have the proper PPE, then I should put first my proper PPE and then help the person. Why this is important? If I have a person that has been exposed to pesticide without any kind of PPE, then instead of having just one person exposed to pesticide, I'm gonna have two persons. The person that I'm helping and myself. So it's very important that whenever we're gonna be helping a person that you think or suspect that has been exposed by pesticide, always wear your own PPE as well. In case of inhalation, the first thing that we have to do with that, other than obviously we have to use our PPEs, is to move that person into a fresh air area. If we leave that person that has inhaled that pesticide in the area where the pesticide may still be there,
Circulating, yeah.
or be circulating, we have to move that person into a fresh air area. That way, we will minimize the exposure, and at least we're gonna make that person make sure that it's not continuing inhaling that pesticide.
Okay.
And then, depending on the accident, we have to always seek medical help immediately. It doesn't matter if it's some kind of small exposure, we have to help medically that person. Every place that has pesticide, they must have some kind of emergency kit that we can actually help that person, either washing away that chemical or that pesticide that washed out into those time of that skin, or just take that person to an actual hospital, depending on the gravity of the situation.
Okay. So we sometimes may confuse heat stress, Florida, imagine that heat stress, with pesticide exposure. There's a difference, and we need to know that there can be a mistaken diagnosis by the untrained professional in this area. So let's talk about heat exhaustion, heat stress, and pest versus pesticide exposure.
Yeah, so basically heat stress and heat exhaustion are two different things. So heat stress is basically the buildup of heat in your body due to your muscles working and being exposed to a hot environment. So if you're outside on a grove or on a farm for a long period of time, you can get heat stress, especially in Florida. So heat exhaustion basically happens when the body is subjected to more heat that it can handle. Okay, so it's not the same as, just being outside working. It's actually being on a place where your body literally cannot handle the heat.
So this is not making an excuse not to work, it's actually getting sick from work.
Exactly, yeah. Your body literally cannot handle it.
Mm-hmm. What's the difference between pesticide poisoning and heat stress, or why do we have to think about those two possibilities in the farming environment?
So when you're dealing with heat stress, right, or pesticide poisoning, how do you know what's happening with you, right? Number one, be aware of your environment. Be aware of what's going on with you. We've discussed PPE in some other podcasts, and as a pesticide applicator, you know that you should be wearing that, right? Well, those PPE can get pretty hot, so if you're out there and the sun's blazing down on you and you know that you haven't really had maybe a spill or anything on you, maybe you just need to cool down, right? But you could also have some pesticide exposure if your respirator wasn't on correctly, or if you didn't wear your gloves and you didn't realize that you touched something that was maybe concentrated or is starting to make you feel sick. So some symptoms to watch out for, of course, is going to be kind of like dizziness. You're going to feel lightheaded. You could feel like maybe nauseous, like you need to vomit. And then, that can even turn into worse symptoms, such as, you faint, you get unconscious, nervous spasms in your body, depending on maybe what you were exposed to at that point. And then even death can happen, unfortunately, from both of these things.
Yeah.
So it's important to know what kind of temperature you're working in, what you've been exposed to, what you have working around you and that you're working with.
Okay. So finally, we come to the last section here, which is the spill. What happens, and everybody that's applying pesticides should have a plan in place by law. But what happens, or what can we do to manage a spill in the case that we have that accident? And the context is that we don't want other people to be contaminated and exposed, and then we would have to also take them, to the clinic, and it's a service to society and to the environment. What can we do to contain, to manage the situation?
So we have gone what we like to call the 3 C's. Those are going to be control, contain, and clean. And this is basically just the guidelines that we have to follow whenever a spill occurs. We know we are not perfect. Spill may occur, so we will try to always avoid that happening. But when that happens, those are the 3 main guides that you may want to go through. So when we're talking about control, it's basically just that. It's controlling that spill to get bigger, or continuing spilling the spillage of that pesticide into either an area or the ground or another place. So basically we want to stop that spillage, like closing a valve or just putting some kind of material that will basically stop the flow of pesticide getting into that soil. So after we control that pesticide, then we're going to contain it. And this is basically just the use of certain barriers in order to maintain that pesticide in a certain area. That way it will reach other non-target areas. So again, we control it, we contain it, and once we got that containment, then is when we can actually clean it. And the way we clean it is with specific materials that are either going to be helping us to actually, 2 options. One, to recycle that pesticide and use it again for future applications, or getting that material into the proper hazardous waste areas. Because not all pesticide we can actually reuse them once they basically are spilled. One of the other things that is very important to do is every employee that's going to mix and load pesticide has to have their own spillage kits. Basically, something happens if I'm in the field working and some kind of spill occurs, I should have my materials in order to actually avoid the spread of this disease around the environment, or as Jonas said, avoid that exposure into the employees.
So if I want to know specifically what products I need to have at hand in order to clean or contain the pesticide, is that on the label as well?
Yes, everything that you need to do in order to control, contain, or clean that pesticide should be listed in the label.
And I'm going back to the formulations piece that we did a few chapters ago. Very important. The label again is the law. We gotta follow that label. We gotta understand what to do before it happens. It's better just to be educated than to scramble in a situation like this one. Again, we're dealing with materials that are designed to have an impact on the life of another organism. We do not want to have one of these accidents happening, but it is inevitable to have something happen. So it's better to be prepared, to be educated on what to do, and then to have all the materials that we need, tools on our toolbox to manage a situation of an emergency. Very important that we understand all of these things that we just discussed. If you have further questions, read the label. If you have further questions, contact your local extension agent. We're here for you to fill those educational gaps that you may have in terms of pesticide application, how to mitigate your impact on the environment and the lives of others. This is The Right Dose. Thank you for tuning in again. See you next time.
The brands and trade names mentioned in this episode were used with the intention of education and not for marketing or advertisement.